You're listening to What the Founders Knew, an in-depth look on the founding fathers of America, who they were, what they did, and how they laid the framework that made America the most successful experiment of true freedom in all of human history.
The verse that Dal just read when Paul was saying to go to look to the ungodly for justice, I think if you keep reading that verse, if I remember correctly, I think Paul almost says it's almost better to just be robbed than to try to seek justice from the ungodly. And that's a pretty incredible concept in the sense that Paul's literally saying that it is the idea that you can get true justice from someone that doesn't judge according to the precepts of God, it's just better to get robbed. And that's a very interesting concept when you have this thing of justice. And that's one thing you have throughout the Old Testament when you study the law. You know, you have the Old Testament, which is the law, right? And then you have the New Testament, which is the law, but it was written on our hearts, right? But in the Old Testament, you have this concept of justice, right? Where if someone offended me or if someone stole from me, there was some kind of retribution in the form of God's law, okay? But when you take it a step farther, Dal, you said, and I wrote it down, it says, can you ever really mandate love? And that was the difference between, I think, the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's this difference of, can you ever mandate love, or can you actually mandate good behavior, right? You can have laws that can try to punish bad behavior, but can a law in itself be enough to make you want to do the right thing? And that's the big difference between when you see the contrast, the Old Testament and the New Testament. But on the fundamental orders of Connecticut, which is what we touched on last week, I mean, that was essentially, they took the law that Moses had in Deuteronomy, and they basically used it to write what really is the type of first modern type of constitution. So when you're writing law, there's a couple of things I want to point out to you. Whenever you see God talking about law, one of the main items is this thing about proclaiming liberty. We touched on it in, I think, 2 classes ago. Leviticus 25:10 actually proclaimed liberty to the captives. But on the flip side of that, we actually have a punishment when liberty is not granted. Right? When you look at Jeremiah, so whenever the Israelites, this is 600 BC, so when God said in Leviticus, free the captives, every 6 years, on the 7th, there's liberty, on the 50th year, if anyone was a captive, you set them free. So they did it for a while, but then they went away from that and actually started to take servants and captives back in. And God sent Jeremiah with a warning. He says, "You have not obeyed me in proclaiming liberty, everyone to his brother and everyone to his neighbor." There's what God says. He says, "Behold, I proclaim liberty to you, says the Lord, to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine, and I will deliver you to trouble among all the kingdoms of the earth." So what you actually have here is a punishment from God for not proclaiming liberty. Okay, so this concept of liberty is something that is very close to the nature of God. All right, now there's this other concept that's laws of nature. Okay, it's something that I never studied it growing up. I don't know it's not part of our vocabulary a lot, but this concept of laws of nature. Can anyone give me a definition, just a stab at what the definition of the laws of nature are? Anybody? Or natural law? What about natural law? Same thing, natural law. Gravity? Okay. We're ruled by that type of law. Absolutely. Freedom? Okay. Anybody else? See here?
We have an innate desire to take and search for God. That's part of the nature that we have, and that's the law of nature.
An innate desire to take laws or precepts from God. That's pretty close. Cicero, I'm going to talk about Cicero just for a second. Cicero, I don't know if you ever studied Roman law or Roman philosophers. Cicero was someone that the founders studied a lot. You see them quoted a lot. Thomas Jefferson. Even some guys from the early church looked at Cicero and studied him quite a bit. But Cicero talked a lot on the natural law. He was born about 100 BC, so 100 years before Christ, died about 40 years before Christ walked the earth. But it's interesting because Cicero was not a Christian, because Christ hasn't come. He was not a Jew. It can be looked at as a heathen, but he still saw and discovered this concept of a powerful creator who revealed natural law to man. He talked extensively about it. I'm just going to read just a quick paragraph. It's important, though, so I want you guys to listen. All right, so what Cicero says, he says essentially that natural law is true law. Okay, true law, right? But he says true law is right reason in agreement with nature. Some of you kind of touched on that. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. So this concept of natural law is absolute. It doesn't change. It summons to duty by its commands and averts from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. It is a sin to try to alter this law, nor is it allowable to repeat any part of it, and it is impossible to abolish entirely. All right, there's one more section. We cannot be freed from its obligations by Senate or people, and that's an important one. I want to come back to that. And we need not look outside ourselves for an expounder or interpreter of it. That's what you touched on, innate inside of us. And there will not be different laws at Rome and Athens, or different laws now and in the future, but one eternal and unchangeable law will be valid for all nations and all times. And there will be one master, one ruler, that is God, capital G, over us all. For he is the author of this law, its promulgator, and its enforcing judge. Whoever is disobedient in fleeing from himself and denying his human nature, and by reason of this very fact, he will suffer the worst punishment. Okay, that's Cicero. That sounds like something that you would see, you can almost do a sermon off that. But there's this concept, and I made a note here. It says, we cannot be freed from its obligations by Senate or people. So what's that saying? That man through law cannot change this natural law. Why? Because it's the law that was innate, that God created when he created us. Here's the other thing. I don't want to touch on it too much, so we're going to do a class on it. The Constitution. Whenever you hear, and I've heard it plenty of times, that you ever hear the concept that the Constitution is outdated? Right? I think we actually had a Supreme Court judge in South Africa. She was there about last year, when they were asking about what type of constitution they should look at. She said, well, you don't want to look at ours because it's outdated. That's our Supreme Court judge said that. But here's what tells me, someone as brilliant as our Supreme Court judge is, that they don't understand this concept of natural law. Okay. So now let me ask you this. Was the Constitution built for a certain time or for certain people? It was not. The Constitution was built to match the laws of nature or the laws of man, and that's something that doesn't change. So it doesn't matter if it's 1776, 1783, or 2020. Why? Because the Cicero points to it, the laws of nature don't change. So you have a document that's not created for a certain time period, but it's a document that was created to govern the laws of nature. That's exactly what God instilled. So I think it's a pretty interesting concept. Well, where does this law of nature come from? It's all throughout the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, Jesus said that the two greatest commandments that we all know are to love the Lord our God with all our heart and to love thy neighbor as themselves. And he says that all the commandments hang on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. In James talks about, he says, Christ's gospel is the perfect law of liberty. So here you have this concept of liberty again. So when you look at natural law, and I want to make sure I set this foundation, but just natural law is something that cannot be changed. All right? Natural law is something that cannot be altered. It cannot be abandoned. It's impossible to abolish. It has universal application to man. And that's one thing that we can't deny. This natural law isn't just for Americans. It's not just for Europeans. It's universal to all man. And we can never be freed from its obligations. To deny natural law is to deny human nature itself. And to ultimately deny the one who created all things. So when you have, I think we see it a lot today, is this idea that we can change or we can perfect our natural being that God made us to be and change it or change the order that God created. And by doing that, you're essentially denying the one who created all things, is what that is. Very, very scary stuff. So this is the concept of natural law. And to our ability to interpret this natural law is really what separates us, man from the animal, right? Because God gave us a reason to be able to discern this natural law. I'm going to give you one more quote from Cicero. And I don't have these there, but I'll put them up on the website if you guys want to find them. But I want to read one more quote here. And this is touching on reason and conviction. This is an element that we're going to touch on next. Reason and conviction. Here's what Cicero says. He says, the animal which we call man, endowed with foresight and quick intelligence, complex, keen, possessing memory, full of reason and prudence, has been given a certain distinguished status by the supreme God who created him. For he is the only one among so many different kinds and varieties of living beings who has a share in reason and thought, while all the rest are deprived of it. This is a good part right here. It says, but what is more divine, I will not say in man only, but in all heaven and earth, than reason. So what's more divine than reason? And when he says, and reason, when it is full grown and perfected, is rightly called wisdom. Therefore, since there is nothing better than reason, and since it exists both in man and in God, the first common possession of man and God is reason. So what he says there is the first thing that man and God kind of had in common, the first thing God instilled to us in the Garden of Eden was this ability to reason, this ability to choose. And since right reason is law, we must believe that men have law also in common. Further, those who share law must also share justice. There's this concept of justice. And those who share these are to be regarded as members of the same commonwealth. All right. So there's interesting concepts in there, but what Cicero's talking about is this idea of that man, what distinguishes him from the animals, and what is a characteristic of God is our ability to reason and our ability to understand. All right. And then he says, so God's law is right reason. All right. So that's reason, God's law. When perfectly understood, is called wisdom. And when applied by government in regulating human relations, is called justice. And there's that concept of justice again. A quote by William Blackstone, he says, upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, so the laws revealed to you and you understand, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these, the laws of nature and the law of revelation. All right, so as we got that concept down, we're going to jump into the handouts there, the Virginia Declaration of Rights.
I think he concluded that by saying wisdom is knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom, and that is no paradox.
That is exactly right. That's exactly, and this is the concept. You can't, knowledge does not equal wisdom. Do you know how many people have a knowledge of the Bible? A knowledge of what it says? And that's not enough. It's not. There's brilliant thinkers that know probably more than the Bible than some of us in here. But that does not equal justice. When you apply God's laws in your life, that's when you get justice. All right. Let's touch on this Virginia Declaration of Rights. So this is June 12th, 1776. So we're going to put a little mark right here. June 12th of 1776. Virginia Declaration of Rights. All right. Now, can anyone tell me why these Declaration of Rights are important? I've got it there, but can anyone tell me just before looking at this at all why they were important? Anybody? Okay. Well, what's important about the Virginia Declaration of Rights, if you notice the date, what else came in 1776? Declaration of Independence, right? Shortly after this, about a month or so after. So here's why it's important. If you just read, and if you look on, it's just probably the back of what we handed you. If you just want to flip over, all the way over, so just kind of turn it all the way to the back. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, so if you actually just turn it all the way in the back, it's on the back page there. And it's a little confusing. Okay. All right, so why is it important? Let's just run through this really quick. The Virginia Declaration of Rights was drawn upon by Thomas Jefferson for the opening paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. He actually pulled it directly from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. All right, it was widely used by other colonies as the basis of the Bill of Rights. So not only did it influence the Declaration of Independence, but the Bill of Rights that we have was influenced directly from this Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Constitution of the United States. George Mason was the author of it, but the section that we're going to touch on today, which is section 16 on religious freedom, was actually assisted by James Madison. And why this is important is down at the Did You Know section. Actually, before we do that, the radical thinking. I want to point out how radical this is. Okay. Here's what it says. It says, stated that a republic had to begin with the formal, legal, binding commitment that individuals had inalienable rights and were superior to any government. Okay. Doesn't seem very radical to us, right? Because that's a concept that, as Americans, is innate in being an American. But at that time, where man was given rights that were superior to government, that was one of the most radical concepts at that time. But I'll tell you, we live in a world today, we have a government that would tell you that it's flip-flop, that the government has superior rights and the man has to abide by them. And that's what what we get when we turn on the TV, when you open up history books, when you hear our own politicians speaking, but that's backwards. All right, now, I want to talk about James Madison just for a second. So before the Constitution, we're going to touch on this as we go through it, Mason proposed that a Bill of Rights actually had to come before the Constitution, and he was voted down. So he didn't just want the Constitution. He actually wanted this Bill of Rights. And he didn't vote for it, which it shocked a lot of people. Even George Washington was surprised by it. Why wouldn't you sign this Constitution? But his stand actually, so Mason, at the first session of the first Congress, Madison introduced a Bill of Rights that paralleled Mason's Declaration of Rights of 1776. So that's how important this Virginia Declaration of Rights is. I mean, it literally helped shape two of the most important documents that established our country and really changed the world. Okay, let's touch on, let's see here. Let's go to, if you flip it over here, it says Notes on the State of Virginia. Okay. Actually, before we do that, the handout, I don't have it up here. Let's read section 16. Did we give them the full the Virginia Declaration of Rights? You guys got that? This is a handout. Let me borrow this for a second. What's that? Okay, yeah, front and back. Okay. So if you turn over to the back of the first handout that we gave you. All right. So, and I encourage you, as when you get home, we're not going to take time to go through all of these. Really important to just run through and read. It's not long. It'll take you 5 minutes to read through all of these. But there's some concepts that I want to point out. Number one, which just says that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which when they enter into a state of society they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their prosperity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So again, there's this concept that we get there for really the first time ever, is that all men are equally free and independent by nature and have inherent rights. But what I want to do is jump down. Let's jump to number 16. Let's read 16. All right, we're just going to run through 16 really quick. Here's what it says. It says that religion or the duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, and that is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. Now, I've had a couple of people tell me, well, David, this idea that the founders wanted Christian principles to be in our founding documents was just unfounded, okay? But, I mean, when you look through this is the document that actually was probably the most influential in our founding documents. And here you have this concept of freedom of religion, but not only that, but it even takes it a step farther, which actually our Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, doesn't necessarily state this, but it says it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. I didn't say that all had to be Christians, but there's this element of Christianity that loving your neighbor, that was essential to being able to govern yourself or to have a government that was not overly dictatorship to the people. All right, now what I want to do is pull out that section. So it just starts with notes on the state of Virginia. It says query 16 at the top. We had a question. I don't know if the guy's here today, but he said, when we were talking about William Penn, and where we said that all Christians of all types could come to Pennsylvania and they wouldn't for fear of persecution. And someone asked me, said, David, did that allow non-Christians to run for office? I don't know if that person's there, I forget who it was. And at the time we said, well, it didn't necessarily say that. It just stated that if you were Christian, that you would never be persecuted for that belief. You could run for office. You would never be persecuted for it. So Pennsylvania was actually different, and New York, I believe, was the other one that was a little bit different. Virginia actually had laws on the books, and we're going to read it, that actually you would be fined, or there was laws against if you went against your Christian faith, if you're born into it. Yeah, we're going to touch on that a little bit. So this is what Thomas Jefferson, and if you notice the date, so this is written 1781, so a little bit after Declaration of Independence. But this is Thomas Jefferson's stance on whether or not we should force citizens to believe in Christianity. And he was against it, and you're going to see why. But there was actually laws, and that's why he is writing on this, that actually said in order to hold office in Virginia, in order to, if you were not baptized, if a parent didn't baptize you, they could be penalized. And there's all these laws that were on the books. But let's just read through this a little bit. So this is Notes on the State of Virginia. Here's Thomas Jefferson. He says, "The first settlers in this country were immigrants from England, of the English Church, just at a point of time when it was flushed with complete victory over the religious of all other persuasions." I'm going to just read the parts in bold, so if you just want to follow along with me with the parts in bold. And here's what it says. The poor Quakers were flying from persecution in England. They cast their eyes on these new countries as asylums of civil and religious freedom. But they found them free only for the reigning sect, or only for the denomination that set up the colony. Here's what it says. Several acts of the Virginia Assembly of 1659, 1662, and 1693 had made it penal in parents to refuse to have their children baptized. So there was actually penalties if you didn't have your children baptized. Had prohibited the unlawful assembling of Quakers. Had made it penal for any master of a vessel to bring a Quaker into the state. Had ordered those already here and such as should come thereafter to be imprisoned till they should abjure the country. So you know who was a Quaker? William Penn was actually a Quaker. So you had laws in Virginia, one colony over, that actually made it illegal to be a Quaker in that state. And this is the colonies that were established for religious freedom. So basically what Jefferson's saying here is like, yeah, they established these countries, these colonies for religious freedom, but only if your denomination lined up with who was the majority in control. All right. Okay, let's go down to the second paragraph. It says, the present state of our laws on the subject of religion is this. The Convention of May 1776, in their Declaration of Rights, that's the Virginia Declaration of Rights, declared it to be a truth and a natural right that the exercise of religion should be free. So he's referring back to the Virginia Declaration of Rights, number 16 that we talked about. All right, turn the page here. So number 2, you should see at the bottom number 2. Okay, it says the execution is by the writ, and this is in Latin, de recto cumbrendo, I think is how you say it, by our own act of assembly of 1705. And here's what the law was in 1705. If a person brought up in the Christian religion denies the being of a God or the Trinity, or asserts there are more gods than one, or denies the Christian religion to be true, or the Scriptures to be of divine authority, he is punishable on the first offense by incapacity to hold any office or employment. All right. So if anyone denied Jesus as God, they were denied to hold any office. That was the first offense. Hold any office or employment, ecclesiastical, civil, or military. So they couldn't even hold military office without it. That was Virginia, 1705. On the second, by disability to sue. So you lost your right to sue. To take any gift or legacy, to be guardian, executor, or administrator, and by 3 years imprisonment without bail. So look at that. So we actually have imprisonment by denying that Jesus Christ is Lord in the state of Virginia in 1705. Pretty interesting stuff. So Jefferson goes on to say, why do we get away from it? Jefferson's going to answer that. It's a good question. All right, this middle part it's a little long, but this is going to answer your question, Roger, I think. Here's what he says. This is a summary view of that religious slavery under which a people have been willing to remain, who have lavished their lives and fortunes for the establishment of their civil freedom. The error seems not sufficiently eradicated. So he's saying, I don't think we necessarily have eradicated this element of religious slavery. That the operations of the minds as well as the acts of the body are subject to the coercion of the laws. But our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. Here's what he says, and this is important. He says, the rights of conscience we never submitted. We could not submit. We are answerable for them to our God. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. And here he points out, he gives an example. He says, but it does me no good, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So he's saying, by my neighbor having unbelief, how does that hurt me in any way? There's no direct hurt or pain or injury to me. He says, if it be said his testimony in a court of justice cannot be relied on, this goes back to Paul, right, saying, well, an ungodly may not be able to give justice. And Jefferson's saying, okay, give him that. Maybe if he's not allowed to be on a court as a jury, fine. If it said his testimony in a court of justice cannot be relied on, reject it then, and be the stigma on him. Here's what, and I love this part, it says, constraint may make him worse by making him a hypocrite, but it will never make him a truer man. It may fix him abstinently in his errors, but will not cure them. It says, reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. I'll say that again. It says, reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them, they will support the true religion by bringing every false one to their tribunal, to the tests of their investigations. They are the natural enemies of error, and of error only. Had not the Roman government permitted free inquiry, Christianity could never have been introduced. Had not free inquiry been indulged at the era of the Reformation, the corruptions of Christianity could not have been purged away. If it be restrained now, the present corruptions will be protected and new ones encouraged. Does that kind of answer your question, Roger, a little bit? It's basically what he's saying there, and we're going to touch on a little bit more on the next page, is that, look, we can force someone to believe in Christ, or we can force someone to profess Christ as their Savior, but that's not going to make him a truer man. What that's actually going to do is make him a hypocrite, in a sense. Okay? And then that's what Jefferson was saying. Do you see where he's coming from on that? Yeah? Okay. Let's keep going here. There's a middle line on page 2. It says, government is just as infallible, too, when it fixes systems and physics. Now, I'm not going to read that section right there, but that's actually a really interesting section in the sense that Jefferson basically attacks the government, saying if we still relied on the government, we'd still think the world was flat, right? Because it was Galileo, who was a private citizen, who said, no, that's not right. We're going to go and look for it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if we really, yeah, you're exactly right. We'd all be gone in a year from now, right? Due to global warming. Okay. Down at the bottom it says, reason and experiment have been indulged and error has fled before them. This is great. It says, it is error alone which needs the support of government, aka global warming, right? And it says, truth can stand by itself. Subject opinion to coercion. Whom will you make, go to page 3, your inquisitor? And we're just going to read through this section right here, and we're going to finish on this. It says, fallible men governed by bad passions, by private as well as public reasons, and why subject it to coercion? Or why force them to believe something? To produce uniformity. He's basically saying that so we're all just the same in what we believed. But is uniformity of opinion desirable? No more than of face and stature. Introduced, the bed of Procrustes then, and as there is danger, then the large men may beat the small, make us all of a size, by loping the former and stretching the latter. All right, here's what we go now. He says, the difference of opinion is advantageous in religion. The several sects perform the office of a censor morum over each other. Is uniformity attainable? Millions of innocent men, women, and children, since the introduction of Christianity, have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned, yet we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? I love this quote. It says, what has been the effect of coercion? To make one half the world fools and the other half hypocrites. Pretty striking quote there. To support roguery and error all over the earth, let us reflect that it is inhabited by 1,000 millions of people, that these profess probably 1,000 different systems of religion, that ours is but one of that 1,000. But if there be only one right, and ours is that one, he's basically saying if what we say is true, if Christianity is the only true religion, we should wish to see the 999 wandering sects gather into the fold of truth. But against such a majority, we cannot effect this by force. Reason and persuasion are the only practical instruments. To make way for these, free inquiry must be indulged. And how can we wish others to indulge in it while we refuse it ourselves? So, I don't know, has anyone ever read Notes on the State of Virginia at all in the past? There's about, I think there's 16 or 17. This is actually one of the only books that Jefferson ever published. The rest of the stuff were his private writings that they took out. But this was actually something that he wasn't his private. This is something that he put out there and he published. And what Jefferson is talking about here is, well, look, if our religion of Christianity, is what he was saying, is the true religion, then we can't force it on others. And if it is true, no matter where we're at, absolute truth will always remain true. And that we can't force someone to believe something that's absolute truth. Okay? And that's what you get this. So he was basically saying, no, we shouldn't force people to be Christians. And that's why if you notice when in his writing of the Declaration of Independence, you notice there that there's really no forcing of the words Christian anywhere in it. I mean, there's no, we're all Christians, because he was very adamant on the fact that if Christianity was to remain true, then men should choose it freely. And that was a concept that you see Christ directly state in the New Testament. All right, so just want to close on here as we close out. We're just going to get a couple more minutes. Deuteronomy 4:29, it says, "But if from thence thou seek the Lord thy God, thou shalt find him, if thou seek him with all thy heart and with all thy soul." So what Deuteronomy is saying is if you truly seek after God, it's not hard, like you will find him. All right. So what we have that the founders wanted, what you see, and you especially see it in Jefferson, they didn't want man following law because it was what they had to do and they'd be punished if they didn't. They actually truly wanted a change of heart. And that is what the freedoms gave to people. If you could just have a change of heart, then you could have access to all these freedoms. All right, not by force or violence, but by reason and conviction. All right, they also knew that absolute truth was eternal and could stand on its own, period. It didn't need the help of government. It didn't need absolute truth could stand on its own. And all other false doctrines would be weeded out by free man's reason experience with natural law. A little bit of concept on liberty. So liberty in a nation is of utmost importance because it allows people to have the freedom to obey or disobey God, to serve him or not to serve him. And this idea of choice, so freedom to choose, is one of the highest manifestations of excellence in human beings that God created. He gave it to us right in the garden. You know, God could have made Adam and Eve with the ability to only choose from the good trees. That's what he could have done. He could have said, Adam and Eve, I'm going to give you the ability, but not really, because you don't have the choice to pick from that tree. But what did he say? He said, you have the ability to follow me or not to follow me. Related to today, you have the ability to be a Christian and serve Christ or not serve Christ. And that's exactly what Jefferson was talking about. I wrote this, a government that maximizes human freedom while still punishing those who do evil will often find its citizens do an amazing amount of good for others and for the world. And so here's this idea of doing good, forced charity. Is there such thing as forced charity? Right. I think the government would want us to believe that there's such thing as forced charity, but is there really forced charity? I mean, that goes... Right. Sure. I mean, the concept of forced charity goes against everything that Christ talked about in free will. And so when people say, oh, well, I don't want to get too political, but, by forcing you to help your neighbor, by forcing you to help the poor, is that what Christ was talking about in the New Testament, to do it by force? Was God talking to government when he said that? Or was God talking to the individual interactions between man? That's what, again, there's a big distinction. And one thing when you study it, when you study the Scriptures, everything in the Scriptures, there's two roles. There's the role of government and there's the role of man. And God is very clear about the distinction between the two. Okay? So when God said to help our neighbor, it wasn't necessarily to government, but to man as interactions to man. So hopefully we got the concept of that. I know we're right about on time here. So again, folks, whenever you talk about when you hear that Christ or the founders didn't want Christ, and Jefferson is usually looked at as the most liberal of the founders. It's not that they didn't want to force Christianity on everybody. They believed in it so much that they believed that with reason and if free men had the ability to choose it, that it would always last. So, all right, any questions, Dal? Go ahead.
I have a question as much as a comment.
Yeah.
You're listening to What the Founders Knew, an in-depth look on the founding fathers of America, who they were, what they did, and how they laid the framework that made America the most successful experiment of true freedom in all of human history.